Today on Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, we have with us Professor David Reiner, who is a Cambridge University professor, and not only that, but was one of the main folks at Cambridge when I was there going through the technology policy program, which was amazing. David, you have a pretty outstanding background, not only educationally, but also professionally. Some pretty amazing institutions, if I recall correctly, McGill, Princeton, MIT. So clearly you're a bit of an underachiever on that front. And then some pretty amazing stuff on the energy side, policy side, Cambridge side, et cetera. But I'd love to hear from you. There's a little tee up for your background. Can we dive a little bit in and who David Reiner is?
Yeah, it's a great question since I've had a bit of a checkered career. Although I think many of the folks actually who do similar things to what I do, energy, climate policy, also have somewhat similarly diverse backgrounds. But my first degree was actually in physics at McGill. My graduate studies at Princeton were in plasma physics, where I started to look at fusion. Although mostly I focused on lasers, and which were always very fun to toy around with, including working with hydrogen fluoride gas, which is one of the nastier things you could possibly work with. But actually, being at Princeton was led for, I don't know if it's quite a Damascene moment, but kind of being exposed to some of the folks doing work on kind of energy policy, like Frank von Hippel, and also I was based at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, which is this big $100 million a year operation funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. Princeton Plasma Physics Lab is where I kind of had this Damascene moment where I kind of was exposed to many of these kind of issues of policy, particularly energy policy. I was sat in rather on classes from people like Frank von Hippel, but also I was working at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, which is this large $100 million a year lab funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, and that kind of made me aware of, it's not just about good science, it's also about funding. Our lab had been, I think, funded quite generously by the U.S. government when the head of the House Science Committee was the representative from New Jersey. And then he stepped down and somebody from Texas took over. And surprisingly, there was less funding available for the lab. And so some of those things kind of sensitized me to the kind of importance of policy and kind of politics on science and energy policy. And I ended up working, ironically, with a fellow at the time who was the assistant director of the lab, a man named Rush Holt. And Rush ended up becoming the the congressman for I think it was the 12th district of New Jersey, and ended up going into Congress. And later became head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and so on after he retired. But that kind of gave me a bit of exposure as I was kind of transitioning away from kind of hard science into kind of the bit of science policy, energy policy that kind of comes up against politics. And then after that, I worked for a couple of years in Washington, D.C., doing consulting for the U.S. government, primarily the Environmental Protection Agency, before going back to school and getting my PhD ultimately in political science at MIT, although I came in through the technology policy program there. And that really got me into the world of climate and climate policy and worked very closely on many of these issues and got to attend the Kyoto summit back in 1997, and so that kind of plunged me deeply into the world of energy and climate policy.
Awesome, that makes sense. Okay, and so starting off with sort of the Cambridge side of things, which I know a little bit better than some of the other stuff, which I'd love to dive deeper into. Can we talk about technology policy for a second? What does this mean, and how does it relate sort of to our everyday lives? I mean, I'm hoping you don't turn this question around on me and see if I actually learned these things.
What did you learn, David?
From doing the program? But
no, that's a great question, and it is a challenge, in part because we've intentionally construed the program here at Cambridge, which is actually modeled on, in some ways, modeled on the MIT kind of sister program, to be quite broad, right? So there are programs in energy policy and space policy and internet policy, so on. But we try and kind of frame it more widely by looking essentially across sectors, across different areas, and see what we can learn, from one, networked industry to another, from one area where there's, quite in many ways determined by policy and politics as much as by technology. And so we kind of try to situate ourselves at that interface. And arguably, not arguably, I think quite clearly, over the last decade or two, we've seen that become more and more urgent, more and more visible at the level of leaders of government, leaders of kind of the largest corporations, paying much more attention to these sorts of issues.
That's for sure. So in that vein, what continues to motivate you to sort of be in this field and shape tomorrow's leaders?
So, well, two things. One is, the being in this space more generally, I mean, is is a bit daunting. I'm always somewhat jealous of colleagues that work in, if you want, either the kind of more fundamental bits of the system, right? So if you're teaching physics, or frankly even marketing for that matter, or accounting, things don't change very quickly, and you can essentially do this, more or less the same things. Whereas for me, when I'm kind of teaching or talking about these issues, we are kind of very much at the cutting edge, constantly kind of renewing and revising things. So, from my perspective, the goal is to, both in terms of my own research and also in terms of what we try and convey to the students, really be right there at the forefront, which can also be a bit exhausting, frankly, to constantly be revising and reframing. But it's also great fun, right? I mean, it is all of these kind of new emerging issues are ones that I'd like to think we can, both by my own very small contribution, help kind of nudge things along, but maybe equally importantly, the kind of classes of, years of students, cohorts of students like yourselves and many others kind of go out into the world, and also each of them have their own little ways of kind of pushing the stone up the hill that we all end up doing.
Indeed, quite a Sisyphean task. In that particular vein, I would say that, and again, this may be a little biased because I'm in the United States, but there is one aspect of technology policy that almost no one in the United States doesn't know that's going on right now. That might have been a double negative, but everybody knows about this, and that is TikTok. I mean, of any app that exists, I don't think any of them have had more scrutiny under the United States government than TikTok. And we've had a hell of a lot of apps here. The internet's been around since the 70s, so on and so forth. But TikTok is, wow. I mean, it exploded onto the scene. Kids love it. I'll admit I scroll it every now and again because it's mindless nonsense. But that said, it's under tremendous amounts of scrutiny. Obviously, that has to do with the Chinese government and whatnot, but there have been aspects of this that don't even mention China. That some of them are not even about the data collection, which is one piece, but there's yet another piece, which is, it seems like it's almost like intentionally giving people ADD or something in this nature. There's lots of mental health effects, et cetera. And so this seems pretty ripe for some cutting edge technology policy type of stuff. Do you have any thoughts on this, or is there anything in the world that you've seen that's related to the sort of this TikTok dilemma that we've got going on?
I mean, what is striking to me, and I think you see this less kind of sitting here in the UK on the other side of the pond, if you will, or less of a complete focus on TikTok in the way that I think there is in the US context, and that I think a lot of that has to do with kind of the broader geopolitical dimension. But if you expand that, and if you're thinking about not just TikTok, but Instagram and all of these other somewhat similar constellation of apps and the effect that it's having on our ability to concentrate, on our ability to pay attention to issues, I think they're quite valid questions. I mean, frankly, from the other side, I think you have the Chinese government putting limits on the ability of teenagers to game as much as they want to, right? Like an hour or something very strict. So at some level, I think governments around the world bring with it quite different, maybe sometimes more heavy-handed or different regulatory approaches. We're all sort of, grappling with these things in different ways. So I think that's one aspect of it, right? One is that you can't really understand, the discourse or the discussion about an issue without thinking about that wider political or even geopolitical context. So many of these issues are really quite, I think, sensitive to, or our interpretation of them is sensitive to, where we're sitting and what's going on in the wider world, and that in itself is interesting, right? So for example, in the UK at the moment, we have the so-called online harms bill, and that had to do with essentially this tragic story of this teenage girl who got a lot of or was able to get a lot of information on suicide and kind of reinforcing information on suicide based on her kind of online surfing behavior. And again, the UK government's response, as somebody who is from my own perspective, small L liberal, it is quite over the top. It's quite extreme in trying to shut down what they perceive as things that aren't, as they say, they're not illegal, but they kind of run afoul of these kind of concerns or sensibilities, and so you kind of understand the place that these that these concerns are coming from, but sometimes you end up with the legislative or the regulatory response that can be kind of a sledgehammer for something that requires some very fine tuning. And so, so I think that I think that's, as I said, in each country's context, you're going to have a very different discussion about what issues happen to have risen to the top. But I think it calls all the more for really thinking about, well, what are the real issues here? Right. So how do you kind of tease out what is it that we're really worried about? And again, in many cases, are the so-called solutions worse than the harms done by these so-called solutions more problematic or have more kind of negative side effects than you'd actually get from being a bit lighter touch in terms of the regulation. But that's always this really big tension whenever you get these kind of issues come to the fore.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree. I mean, and again, especially in the Western world, we grapple with this this all the time, the sort of freedom of speech versus freedom of access and information, et cetera. And it's a tough one. I mean, there's no question. I don't think we've ever quite been in, even beyond technology, I don't think we've ever quite been in the conundrums that we're in these days with regards to sort of freedom of speech, and the like. There's just a lot of different stuff out there. That said, I understand where we're coming from with the socials, and coming with that, but I did want to bring up something that I thought was rather amusing, and I'm hoping that you might have a solution to this problem, although I don't know. I sure as hell don't. And that is, I'm not sure if you saw this, but when Zuckerberg was testifying in front of Congress, he was effectively explaining how the internet works to them. I mean, one of them literally was like, "Can you read what's on my Wi-Fi?" And he was like, "No, it doesn't." Well, but Facebook provides the internet. Nope, we're one website out of billion. Like it was. I mean, I was embarrassed, and I wasn't even asking the questions. But basically, it just showed that clearly not all people in Congress, but a lot of these people just are so disconnected from the standard experience that people have. I mean, even non-technical folks understand Wi-Fi, at least to some degree, and most of them don't think Facebook is the internet outright. I mean, we used to have that problem when people would dial up to AOL or something like that. They didn't know, anything outside of that walled garden. But at present, usually people know that there's other things out there, and these folks didn't know that. So how do we? I mean, if we're going to push any policy whatsoever, how do we do that in such a way that we get these folks on board? Because it seems, at least again from my own perspective, that man, a tremendous amount of education is required before we even start talking about, hey, there's some regulations we need to pass, or for that matter, get rid of because of X, Y, and Z. It's like if you don't understand that Facebook can't see everything that's going on your Wi-Fi, for starters, I'm not sure how we even cross the next bridge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it partly reflects kind of the biggest challenge, or one of the big challenges we face with thinking about technology policy more broadly, which is kind of the slowness of our institutions, the inertia that's associated with institutions. And as an example, the idea that having geriatric folks that are fairly disconnected. I mean, most of in the U.S. context, most of them are lawyers, or have that sort of a legal training. That would not be a bad thing in the 1950s or the 1970s, particularly, and arguably gives you many of the. It's a sort of background that you would need to draft laws, right? So the idea that and you're more experienced, that's all seen as a good thing, right? Particularly if you have common law jurisdictions like the UK or the US, where actually, again, understanding precedent is a good thing, right? So historically, the institutions have built up where we have lots of older folks who are trained in the law. Now, I mentioned Rush Holt, who at the time, I think, when he was in Congress, formed what he called the bipartisan physics caucus, which was him and this one Republican, Vern Ehlers from Michigan, right? Meaning, there's 2, 3, and I'm sure it's probably similar today, a very small handful of people out of the many hundreds of our legislators that have any sort of scientific or technical background. And the vast majority continue to have this kind of legal, background. And so already that's, I think, problematic in terms of addressing these, frankly, complicated issues. And then on top of that, you have inevitably, do you want your parent or grandparent legislating? Well, on other issues, it might not be as much of or it might be not as flagrantly problematic, But when it comes to issues of technology and understanding these, frankly, nuanced issues, how do you hope to make progress when these, legislatures are so disconnected? And that's really hard, as I said, because the nature of an institution, for good or for bad, has inertia, and inertia can sometimes be a good thing in resisting change that happens too quickly. But if we need it to kind of, get its head around AI, for example, how on earth do we expect, people in their 80s to do that?
Excellent. I wanted to backtrack for a half second, kind of moving away from this back into physics. Hydrogen fluoride gas. You mentioned this. What's the deal with hydrogen fluoride? I don't know anything about hydrogen fluoride gas.
It is scary, actually. It's a sort of thing where I forget how many. I mean, very, very trace concentrations will kill you. So the kind of safety protocol. So at the time, so it's a plasma physics lab, and what you're trying to do is have a really high intensity but high frequency pulse laser. So picosecond laser at the time, and we used a krypton fluoride laser, and so you needed that you needed to get the fluorine in, and fluorine gas is, as was proven in World War I and so on, is a really nasty a nasty compound, a nasty chemical. So yeah, that's quite fun to it gives you some perspective on you can't make small mistakes in some areas, right? If in most of what we do, if we want to stop our podcast, we stop it and oops, sorry, I misspoke, I'll try again. Whereas if you're dealing with things that actually are so dangerous, there is no, we had, again, multiple kind of barriers, so that even if you did make one mistake, there was something else to catch you after that. So you do, it's kind of a good environment to work in, where there is consequences there are real consequences from mistakes.
That's interesting. My overly pop culture brain immediately goes to that 80s movie with Val Kilmer, Real Genius, where they're making the lasers and everything. I don't know if you ever saw it, but they're doing all this stuff, and sounds like an interesting environment. You're working in it at Princeton. So I'm guessing because of that environment, I guess you kind of mentioned it earlier, that was sort of how you got into policy, but you have a different aspect as well. You've also done quite a bit with sort of climate change and energy. I'd love to jump in there as well. What's some of the back, like, I guess the first question would be this, and again, a very hot button issue in the United States in particular. It's not as hot button in other countries, but very hot button in the United States, which is sort of the politics around climate change impact and the progression, and for that matter, implementation of potential solutions. Like, I know Europe's got the 2030 plan, among other things. Still have no idea how France is going to hit that, considering they were already basically entirely nuclear, but whatever. I mean, what does that look like from your perspective? I mean, how do we address some of these things? Are there solutions for the United States such that we can sort of get ourselves back on track? And then, for that matter, for the rest of Europe and Asia, like, I'm kind of asking this on a global scale. Like, what does this look like?
That's a really hard question, and it's huge. I mean, it's because it's pervasive, right? The nature of energy is, affects everything. It's in every part of the economy. There's some sectors, obviously, that are particularly vulnerable, but as we've seen, even in if we think of data centers, every aspect. If you're growing very rapidly, then all of a sudden data centers become this major kind of source of demand, and we've seen many of those companies shift quite quickly to renewables. In other cases, you have things like Bitcoin, which are also kind of huge additional burden on the climate by especially if it's produced from say coal fired electricity. But fundamentally, it is trying to solve many so-called wicked problems, really incredibly difficult problems. So you're at some level trying to deal with huge technological challenges that we've faced for decades. The reason why I started thinking about plasma physics and fusion was because that was potentially a STEM-driven, physics-driven solution to the energy problem, right? So that's on the one hand the looking for these technological solutions, wind, solar, hydrogen, electrification, all these fusions even coming back, nuclear fission. So all these technological solutions. But then on top of that, there's all sorts of questions about deployment. How do you get these technologies onto the system? And then kind of behavioral, right? So there's all these issues to do with how do we get people to change their behavior, and that's incredibly difficult and incredibly sensitive. Things like what we eat, right? So livestock, methane from cows, famously, mostly burps, just to be clear, are responsible for a good chunk of the contribution to climate change. Well, how willing is any politician going to be to change, to try and change people's diets? And then on top of that, or layered on top of that, this is a global problem, right? So as a global problem, that brings in all sorts of issues to do with, international equity. India is now the largest, country by population. It's also vastly smaller in terms of its, GDP per capita, its economic output per capita. And so, what position are we in to tell India, which has, which we would expect to, to be a big driver of emissions over the next decade or two or three, to tell them to rein in their energy consumption, that they, don't do like us and don't burn coal to grow, rely on other cleaner solutions. So it does become a really sensitive topic as well from this kind of wider geopolitical lens. So I find it great fun because you kind of throws in all these issues to do with, technology and, both the development of the technology and then the adoption and deployment of the technology. But then on top of that, public willingness to change their behavior or to support new technologies, and then this kind of wider kind of international lens.
Okay. Let me ask something more pointed. What are 3 things we could do tomorrow? Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that these would be easy things. I'm just saying, what are the actionable 3 things that, like, again, this is wave magic wand territory. What could we do? And just to note, I'm a big steak guy, so that's that would be the cow thing would be very tough. I love cow.
Like lab grown,
but maybe that's one of them.
So I mean.
But are there like 3 things where it's like, yeah, I mean, well, the whole world just agrees we're going to do them tomorrow. Obviously, this is, unrealistic, but I'm curious, like, if there are 3 things we could push towards as a global community, what would those 3 things be? And I'm sure there's more than 3, by the way.
So part of the problem, of course, is that it's so multi-dimensional, right? So I like showing kind of a pie chart of all the different sectors that are contributing to climate change. And part of the problem is there isn't you can't point to that guy and that guy is responsible for most of it. It's kind of, cement is responsible for 2%, and the chemical sector is responsible for another few percent, and methane from landfills is responsible for a few more percent, and your cows and livestock are another few percent. And so part of the problem, of course, is that it's this kind of accumulation of many different contributors. I suppose if you're thinking about it in terms of what, why, kind of the cross-cutting way in which we might be able to make some change. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems is kind of this focus on what we as individuals can do, because the reality is it's a systemic problem. And
I'm sure of that, but I think the saying is, how do you consume an elephant, and it's one bite at a time, right? So, I guess my real thing is like, what are the three first bites that we take?
Yeah. So to me, it's about getting our incentives lined up so that we're moving in the right direction. So an obvious thing you can do is stop subsidizing the dirty stuff. So, we continue to give really very generous subsidies to either fossil itself or to energy use, energy consumption. So, it's a bit like the Hippocratic Oath, right? So first, do no harm, right? So at the very least, can we stop subsidizing the bad things? Next, I think the question is, can we do more to kind of reward those things that are moving in the right direction? And that might be, again, at the individual level, at the corporate level, at the national level. So the more that we can do to get things aligned. Now, again, that can be challenging because that can mean things like taxing carbon. That can be, particularly in a country like the U.S., but not just the U.S., pretty much any other country. It's quite a sensitive topic. But unless you're kind of making it more, more attractive, that factors into every decision that we make, right? So you can't just kind of come in and try and whack-a-mole everywhere because they'll keep popping up. So really what you need to do is somehow find a way of kind of shifting us as an entire economy. And, you can do it by, if you're getting more in revenues, hypothetically, you could reduce our income taxation. Now that gets in all sorts of other issues to do with how, who's hurt by this. And if you drive a lot, for example, then inevitably you're going to be up in arms against this. But again, as a society, as an economy, if we can move to reward good things and penalize, or at least not subsidize bad things, that's kind of the basic logic that you'd want to start with.
Sure. I actually ran across a plan. It's the incentive thing is sort of triggering a memory. I ran across a plan years and years ago. It was at least a decade ago, maybe more. Actually, it was prior to Cambridge, so it was more than a decade ago. I want to say maybe 15 years, where someone was basically trying to put this policy plan in action for his company, and the idea was that if you built a building over X size in the United States, that you were going to be mandated by law to put solar panels on top, no matter what. And effectively, it was like, if you actually look at what that looks like, and it wasn't houses, it was all commercial and industrial buildings, but it was, if we get these things to effectively feed back the grid, and then they get paid some small subsidy for doing it as well, but like, you don't have a choice, you have to do it. It's like, just like you have to have certain regulations on HVAC when you build a commercial building and so on and so forth. This was like just yet another regulation that you would have to do. It was effectively saying like, we would almost be able to almost hit net zero, assuming we could backfill the building. And obviously you don't do it overnight, because like, yeah, I mean, this is a 10-year regulation, something of this nature, like you have 10 years to do it, and there's some subsidies for doing it, and various things of this nature. But effectively it was like, yeah, I mean, once we end up doing this, you can almost get to net zero. Now, the problem then becomes, of course, storage of the energy, which is, a battery issue or whatever. But like, that's, again, let's cross that bridge. In excess of energy, is not a bad thing. Cross that bridge as you come. And it seemed like a really interesting solution for me. Are there other things like proposals that you've heard of? I agree that this one was pretty grandiose, but I still liked it. Like, I was like, this is like, the guy would make a tremendous amount of money on this. But not only that, it was like, but it's not just a money grab. This was, no, I mean, let's really, like, this is real progress. Let's get somewhere. Are there things like that you've heard of, or you think that we could potentially implement, like as not necessarily even the whole world, but like as individual societies? Maybe the UK is a model for this, maybe one of the Nordic countries, but something where we could do a pilot and be like, hey, this is pretty amazing.
Yeah, so I mean, there are all sorts of ideas. I mean, one is for example, on heating systems, and Italy had this program in place where you're trying to essentially make it easy for the individual to say, okay, how do I know that if I shift to a heat pump, I'll be better off? And essentially, there was almost like a guarantee that if you shifted to the cleaner alternative, you wouldn't lose out. Because I think there's always a concern. I think if you think of some of these investments that people need to make in their home, they think, oh, well, is this worth it? Is the return fast enough? And so the more that you could do to try and encourage that behavior would be one thing, kind of more at the household level. On the other side of things, there are proposals like my colleague at Oxford, Miles Allen, talks about, which is the other place.
Scary.
But more generally, I mean, the idea of it actually started with Ron Oxborough, who's from Cambridge. So there we go.
There we go. But solidarity.
But the idea of a if you want almost like a deposit refund system for carbon. And Ron knew about this, particularly as a geologist and former chairman of Shell and House of Lords and other good things. But he proposed, well, if oil and gas companies take take the oil out of the ground, and they're responsible then for the CO2, they almost then have a duty of care to then dispose of the CO2. So it's almost, you leave it up to them as you figure out how to do it, but it's the onus ends up being put on the oil and gas companies. Now, again, in all of these cases, there's the practicalities and the inevitable lobbying and other things that might happen. But as you say, it might well be in certain contexts or certain societies, we might see that to be more feasible. A country like Norway, which has made a huge amount off of the oil and gas industry, and has, because it's small enough and, kind of far-sighted enough, able to try and square that circle, so they put a huge amount into getting electric vehicles off the ground, for example, far more than any other country. So again, you could imagine those sorts of places being the ones that might at least demonstrate how this might work.
Is there anything specifically promising that you have your eye on? You're like, I want that to work. So like, maybe it's like, I'll give you, I'll answer this from my side, which is basically like, I've got a buddy whose friend has actually got a company, and they're basically trying to use, they're basically trying to do fusion, but cold fusion, like literally room temperature. And it sounds funny, but like basically what they end up doing is like using these physics properties, like the Alcubierre drive, the sort of warp drive, but they do it on such a micro level that, at that level, you don't need infinite energy to be able to make this work. And so it's basically like almost like warping the particles on top of each other such that they have to fuse. So it's an interesting concept. And I thought that was like really cool. I was like, wow, yeah. I mean, cold fusion would be like the ultimate type of deal. That would be pretty unbelievable. That would be almost like unlimited energy ad nauseum. But at the same time, it's like, right, but like that's cool, but it's still science fiction-y until it's not. So what do we have today that maybe we're not paying enough attention to. Like I don't hear enough about hydrogen, and maybe it's because it's still like we haven't figured out a great way to make it sort of not explosive. And then another thing I don't hear enough about, and I was a huge fan of this. I think I wrote a paper in your class about this, but like I was always a big fan of tidal. I know that there's some concerns there because they say it kind of messes up the local ecosystems for the sea life and whatnot. But in certain locations like that tide is pulling in and out every single day nonstop. I mean, that's the moon pulling it. It's not going to really stop. I mean, it seems like you could generate unbelievable amounts of energy effectively nonstop there. But again, I'm not the expert. So what looks promising from your front?
So, I mean, the big challenge is just how long it takes to deploy anything and how long it takes to really scale things up to any reasonable way. And so I think that ends up being the tension in all these things. And many, as somebody who comes with a physics background, so things that are attractive, elegant, very fun technical solutions are really difficult to scale up on the kind of timescales that are kind of interest. And so that ends up being the hardest bit. I mean, an area that, for example, that has received a fair bit of attention, say, from the venture capital community, has been on direct air capture. And that's the idea of pulling, we've got 350 parts per million of CO2 in the air, and we're essentially plucking with tweezers out not quite. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, but very nice ideas of how you might want to do that. The problem, of course, is that scaling up is how you actually turn that into a viable proposition, right? And again, we think about what we like to call these kind of marginal abatement cost curves, right? Direct air capture, some of these, elegant ideas can be done, but they can be done at $1,000 a ton. So you can do lots of things at $1,000 a ton. What starts to get more interesting is what can you do at $100 a ton, which is not far from where, say, the European emissions trading scheme is. Like the carbon price in Europe is, just south of $100 a ton. And in that context, well, then there are lots more things that could be done there. But then how do you actually get these things to market, right? So, wind and solar now are much cheaper. But where can we deploy wind? Well, we deploy wind off the coast of Scotland or off the coast of northern Germany. And then the problem, of course, is totally. Okay, the boring bit, but sometimes the really difficult bit is, okay, we need then a transmission line to get the wind that's spinning in North Dakota or Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany and get it from those kind of wind turbines in the middle of nowhere to demand centers in, Houston or, southern Germany or southern England from Scotland. And so that's, the boring bits of, so in many ways, the supply, we have lots of potential supply. But the hard bit is really cobbling that system together. And for that, you mentioned batteries earlier, we need storage. So we need both short-term storage in the form of batteries, but also potentially longer-term storage, potentially. But we also need to think about how we actually make these systems work in practice. And that's kind of the less elegant bit. How do you convince communities in the middle, in the middle of Germany or in the middle of Texas or middle of northern England to say, oh yeah, these power lines that you're bringing in this electricity, yeah, I know it's going to reduce my house value by 20%, but yeah, sure, go ahead. right? I mean, so it's a perfectly, people talk about NIMBYs, but I mean, in many ways, it's perfectly legitimate for communities to say, what the hell? Why are you going to be doing this to us? We don't see any benefits. The generators get the benefit. The people who are using it ultimately get benefit. And we in the middle, we're just supposed to kind of sit on our hands and accept this. So, I think to me, it's those parts of the problem that end up being more difficult than the technology side, because, you're right. We could use more tidal power. We could use more fusion or fission and lots of things that we could use. But and the cheaper they are, the better it is for the system. But frankly, that isn't most of the problem, or at least to me, not the most difficult part of the problem. The real problem is that deployment and actually getting it from, point A to point B in many cases.
Okay, that's fair. I feel like that's the case for a huge amount of industries. Is the really sort of unsexy part is like, yeah, but that is the rub. Like we've got the top end and the bottom end, but the middle kind of is the, that's the infrastructure piece where it's like, this isn't super sexy, but like, this is the part that we really need to figure out and solve. Okay. That definitely makes some sense there. I want to switch topics for a half second and jump into artificial intelligence, which is sort of like the talk of the global town at present. There's been a lot of stuff on this, specifically on generative AI, although there are lots of different types. Technology moves really fast. We've kind of already discussed that. But AI is like, yeah, you thought you were moving fast. Now watch this. And it's moving, I don't want to say infinitely, but it's moving almost an order of magnitude faster. I think with the first iteration of users really understanding what a transformer can do. I mean, they may not know what a transformer is, but that's the T in GPT. But like that generative pre-trained transformer, I think people started to really understand this, and it's like, wait, I can tell something a picture that I want and it'll just draw it. Like I know Adobe's got some stuff like that. That's pretty incredible. Midjourney. I mean, there's a bunch of them out there. So it's not just Chat GPT. It's not just, hey, answer really cool questions and, write me term papers.
Yes, we're busy revising our standards as we speak. Yeah.
I'm sure. But beyond that, like, there's stuff we haven't even used it for. Like, for instance, molecule discovery will be interesting. Training it, doing a GPT on a specific subset of data, which, by the way, a friend of mine who's been on the podcast, Razib Khan, a rather prolific geneticist, he writes these 20 and 30,000 word articles. They're incredible. But literally we there's a few people in sort of a group we hang out with, and one of them trained this GPT of Razib GPT, and it was just, you can ask it any question on any article that he's ever written. And he's a tremendously prolific writer on Substack, and you end up getting this huge knowledge base just on that type of stuff. So I guess my question is rather broad, which is like, what does this look like going forward? I mean, there's energy things, there's potential new molecule discovery, which obviously that's going to be big for drugs, but probably also really big for physics. There's almost assuredly going to be there's guaranteed to be massive implications inside of policy in particular. And with that said, like we already talked about, that some of these guys don't even have any clue how the internet works. How in God's name are we going to explain to them this thing? And then you're going to have people freaking out thinking that we've created, the HAL 9000 computer from 2001, and it's going to take over the planet. There's already a lot of doomsayers like that. I'm not one of them. But like these various things were like, oh, it thinks now. It's like, no, it doesn't. But I know that it looks like it does. But what does that look like from your perspective? I'm sure that there's been quite a few things, not to mention, again, the thing that we talked about offline, just being able to grade term papers and seeing if a human being actually wrote this thing. So there's a lot there to unpack, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I told my students this term that I didn't want them using generative AI to write their term papers. And a few of them misunderstood me and said, "Oh, so we can't write about generative AI as a topic?" I'm like, no, it's a great topic, but I want you to write it, not ChatGPT, right? So, I mean, I'll start from the perspective of maybe a bit of a historical perspective, which may not make me all that popular at times, but I think the reality is you're right. I mean, maybe we're talking about an order of magnitude change here, and it will be undoubtedly disruptive, and it will be undoubtedly disruptive, particularly in certain sectors and certain jobs that might well have end up costing people their livelihoods, and they'll have to retrain or find other ways of making a living. And that's serious and understandably why people might be concerned. And it's also true that it probably is hitting the white collar side as opposed to the blue collar side of the fence more, and maybe that's why there's a bit more angst that we're hearing in in the media and Substack and other places like that than otherwise might be the case. So, but I do think that, again, if we think of it in a historical context, my old MIT professor Gene Skolnikov always used to say, well, every time people keep talking about how quickly technology is accelerating, I think back to the telegraph. And again, if you think of it, if we think about these things this isn't linear. These do come in kind of quantum steps. But, the idea of how we were able to transmit information, pre-telegraph and post-telegraph, was really quite remarkable. It just, if you think back to the world pre-telegraph, what is the fastest that you could get information from one place to the next? Stick somebody on a horse and set them off, right? Stick somebody on a ship and set them off. And the idea of being able to communicate in, essentially instantaneously, right? The constraint was no longer how that time, but it was how quickly you could type to get that information into the telegraph to get across to, say, the other side of the Atlantic. And that is, again, transformative. The steam engine was transformative. So we've had a number of really quite dramatic revolutions. The internet, arguably, again, thinking of a world pre-internet, which I can just dimly remember, that's not that long ago. And so I do think that these leaps are really important and will be very disruptive, and will be very disruptive for certain individuals and sectors and countries and economies and so on. And I think there is a genuine issue to do with kind of absorptive capacity and so on. But I think fundamentally, we sort of have been here before. It will, I'd like to hope or like to believe that what it will ultimately be doing is, kind of working hand in hand with our existing systems that will, hopefully enhance productivity in many areas. Hopefully we'll get rid of a lot of the, frankly, crap work that everybody needs to do that could be, be done. The idea that, if you think about it from an efficiency or an inefficiency point of view, the idea that everybody's having to write the same stupid code that everybody else is kind of spending some time on, and you could just get it to, instead of spending the money on a consultant, but you spend the money, you just get ChatGPT to do, the potential for that to free up, time and to spend on more, if you want, productive things, that could really be important in the same way that the steam engine would have, or the telegraph. But again, that doesn't diminish what could be really huge kind of societal disruptions in that process, right? If your job had been, not to exaggerate, buggy whip, the equivalent of the buggy whip manufacturers, and we could see many more of those. Well, that can be really problematic, and if it's causing lots of people to go through that, then there might well be a case for thinking about how do we regulate this? How do we avoid kind of the dystopian version of what might happen? But fundamentally, there's nothing particular about AI that's any more problematic. Again, I'm taking a, if you want, slightly optimistic view of that it's not going to decide to that who needs these humans and let's get rid of them because they're just kind of causing trouble. And I also don't believe that kind of the general AI, the AGI, is really anywhere near on the horizon either. So it ends up being really just something that will potentially be a huge help in many ways. But it also can, at the same time as leading to, as like any other big disruption, lead to lots of other problems that we're going to need to get a handle on. And back to your original point about the folks and the legislators, and do we have that capacity, right? Are the people who are thinking about this, can they really get a handle on, can they get a grip on this? And I think that is arguably one of the biggest problems in all this.
Yeah. There's a bit of a saying in the software engineering world, where, because people are like, oh, do we really need software engineers anymore? I mean, we just have ChatGPT do it. And I'm like, yeah, in order to obsolete software engineers, users would have to know what they want. So we're very much safe, very, very, very safe, among other things. But beyond that, yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing. I believe very recently there was a story about, oh man, what happened? Something about someone generated a picture of something that happened at the Pentagon and it didn't really happen, or some sort of video. Let me Google this. Something about the Pentagon. Yeah, fake image of explosion near the Pentagon stirs concerns over artificial intelligence. And the thing is, I believe the market actually dipped because of that. So there's definitely some rough stuff that could potentially come down the pike. And again, this is the reason that I get nervous about this stuff is, I'm a big freedom of speech fan, very big freedom of speech fan, and I want to restrict as little as humanly possible on that. I mean, obviously we've done some pretty good ones, which is kind of like fire in a theater, and I don't know. I mean, maybe that picture was the sort of the equivalent of like, yeah, I mean, you just caused a panic. That shouldn't be protected. And it's like fair. But where are those lines, I guess, is the real question, because now you, I mean, when that decision was made, it was, I mean, what's the equivalent of doing that in that age? And it's like, no, there really isn't. You're basically going to yell something out that's not true. And now with AI, it's like, yeah, but what's artistic expression? What's, you end up in these really, really, really difficult lines. And again, this is why I actually really enjoyed technology policies, because these lines become so blurred at that level. It's like technology is pretty cut and dry and policy isn't. And so it's really interesting when you end up sort of fusing these two together and being like, there's something that you can put some very hard and fast rules because it's almost all scientific based, therefore provable. And on the other hand, you've got policy, which is almost the exact opposite. There's almost no hard and fast rules. It differs per country, per culture, per everything. And then even in the country, it strongly differs between people, et cetera. And how do you fuse those two things? It seems like that's really, really, really difficult. And then when you get to AI, which is, now you have this thing that's based on hard and fast rules, and yet it can do virtually anything. And I think that's the real problem, is like you're almost in the middle again now, right? Where that's kind of where I see AI is like that real crux of imagine a technology that you can measure in every way, but it can do anything. So it's got almost unlimited capability. Where do you even start?
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it is daunting. As a start, I think you at least want to begin to have serious conversations about what needs to be done, where we need to draw lines, where we need to, as you say, make the fire in the theater type exceptions. To their credit, the EU, for example, has spent a fair bit of time over the last few years thinking about this. They had a parliamentary kind of a special committee focused on AI. They've come up with an AI Act where they, again, focus on particularly on, I think, what they call high risk areas, things to do with, policing and security and elections, I think. And, so certain areas where there will be, especially sensitive to, at the same time as wanting to allow the, development of what can be this really important, powerful tool mechanism that will assist in lots of other parts of the economy growing, right? So what there is, it's this whole baby in the bathwater sort of problem. If we are so obsessed or so kind of concerned with a dystopian outcome that we kind of put in this really rigid, really tough set of regulations, requirements, will kind of kill off or really kind of inhibit the system. Or on the other hand, if we are completely hands off, we run the risk of some of these dystopian ideas actually coming to pass, right? If we don't take seriously the fact that there are bad guys out there, that there are foreign actors, there are people who are genuinely trying to cause stock markets to crash, or to cause a particular stock to crash because they're going to make a huge amount of money off of it, and so on. So again, that's some of that's not new, right? If you follow the career of Vladimir Putin, you see kind of a history of using these kind of false flags and disinformation and so on. So these at some level they aren't new, but they run the kind of plausible risk of becoming much easier to believe, harder to create even more confusion. And so again, how do we kind of thread the needle? How do we actually kind of get through this process while, on the one hand being encouraging of, what can be a really important tool, and on the other hand can also be, quite obviously used for bad things, and by bad guys. And so how do we actually do that? And well, again, it is you want to see some seriousness of purpose, serious effort to really try and get a handle on it, because the danger is if it's not done, if you don't really get a handle on say regulating it, you're likely to see excess, and that will kind of lead to this kind of overreaction and overregulation.
Makes sense. Definitely makes sense. It's a conundrum, to say the least, right?
Tough. These are tough things to get a handle on. Yeah.
I do want to come back to some of these, but before we do that, I've had a couple of education has actually been a pretty hot topic on this podcast. At the grade school level and at high school and collegiate, et cetera. And I wanted to I wanted to talk to you about that quickly because you're the first, hopefully not the last, but you're the first Cambridge professor that I've had on. And I absolutely adored my time there. I mean, absolutely adored it. It was unbelievable. But it is the most unique educational experience that I've ever even heard of. Oxbridge in particular has this style that I don't think anybody else has even remotely emulated, much to their own detriment. And a lot of places don't really realize, like, there isn't this weird rote memorization thing of like rote memorization of facts and regurgitation on a test, and then you pass. And if it falls out of your head, you're not really worse for the wear. Can you sort of describe from your perspective, the differences? I mean, there's so many, there's the tutors. I don't think people have any concept of what that is outside of Oxbridge. Beyond that, there's like how the learning is actually done. And it's like, well, it's your dime. You learn what you want to learn. We're not going to, force you to do a particular topic, et cetera. So, with very few exceptions, obviously math is like, well, you kind of have to learn X, Y, and Z. I mean, there are some exceptions where it's like there's not that much of a choice, but especially for a lot of even in the engineering departments, even just a standard double E department, there's just this massive wide range of topics you can kind of go down, and it's not. I mean, none of it's really rote memorization and then multiple choice, and there's just a tremendous amount of essays, lots of written things to really explore the topic and thought. And almost, I mean, even when you're asking roughly the same question, no two people's essays will probably be even remotely close. Like, a lot of them are just massively dispersed. So can we talk through the sort of the Oxbridge system and why it's unique? I mean, I almost wanted to say the word better because I genuinely believe that, but like that's maybe a little bit polarizing, but just why it's so different.
I mean, there are a couple of things there, right? So one of, and I think arguably the undergraduate experience is even more different than the graduate experience, which went through. And again, the question is also one of replicability, and I think that is a question, at least, because one advantage that, I mean, obviously it's not just true of Oxford or Cambridge, it's true of a number of other leading universities, is, we're kind of overwhelmed by kind of overqualified people. And so in many ways, the cohorts that we bring in are just so superb. That puts you in a really good position. And I think, there is a question as to how easily, as I said, replicable what would be necessarily if you tried to ripple that down kind of more broadly, where you couldn't be quite as incredibly selective. But again, one advantage that we have is that knowing that we have this kind of crop of incredibly brilliant students, it does give you sort of the confidence or the ability to allow them to be more self-directed is I think one thing, right? So that, I think, again, if you're in a, I don't know, not to denigrate, community college or other sorts of institutions like that becomes much harder to imagine necessarily that would be, whereas actually at some level getting across the basics is actually a really important part of what many institutions do. But I think the other part of it, again, is the tradition or the kind of the mechanism that we have here, as I said, particularly with the undergraduates, is that, rather than having individual, a big, large lecture class and then some teaching assistants, every college has their own fellow in a particular area, sub area. And so often you have this idea that there'll be, 4 or 5 students and, essentially a faculty member who can, a college teaching officer who will kind of walk the students through a particular topic. And so that kind of small group approach, I think, has been quite, it kind of ripples its way through the institution. So where the idea is we're not broadcasting as as lecturers, or rather the way in which we expect people to process that. Inevitably, I'm giving a lecture, it's broadcasting. But when we then expect students to go away and do something with it, we end up putting a lot more onus on them, right? So just even in terms of, number of contact hours. I mentioned I went to MIT as a grad student. We probably have half as many or less than half as many contact hours from a teaching perspective, and that for better or for worse ends up pushing a lot of the work onto the students. As I said, that partly is because we have the confidence in the students to be able to handle it, and that's not an easy, not necessarily a given. But I think, having done that, that means that, okay, well, you take ownership. And I think that's really an important part of what we then try and convey.
I mean, honestly, that was, I was freaked out. I'll be totally honest. I was freaked out when some of these classes started giving out the sort of the reading lists. And I was like, there's 50 books on this. I'll never, like, if I took one class, I'm barely going to get through this. But it was explained. But again, it dissipated very quickly because it was explained. But like, at first you're just like, oh my God, I'm in big trouble. Like, all these people are going to be way smarter than me. They're apparently like unbelievably fast readers. I'm a pretty fast reader, but like apparently these people all have eidetic memories. They can just photo capture pages. I'm in trouble. And it turns out it's like, no. There's 50 books on there on purpose, because these are the ones that, like, almost assuredly your professors probably read every one of these. And it's like, these are the ones that is like, there's so many different ways you can walk down this path. Choose your own adventure type of deal. But hey, these two books, these are the ones that we stress. And these particular chapters in these books, and it's like, this is going to give you the fundamentals. This is going to give you the ability to choose, hey, that's the path I want to take. Because if you walk into it and you don't have a background in certain of these things, like I don't have any background in energy policy, but like, so there were certain chapters, certain books, it was like, oh, okay, now I have like these bite-sized chunks where I'm like, okay, I can start to see each one of these and I understand. And then you look at the other books, you're going, oh, that's interesting. It's not 50 random books. It's 50 books that are very, very specifically curated to each one of these potential paths. And it's like, you could just read one book from each one of them and you'd have a massive arsenal of knowledge after that. Or it's like, no, I really want to hone in on this particular discipline. But I just, it was overwhelming at first. And then I was like, oh, okay, I see the direction this is going, which was interesting because, again, like, some of the questions that would be asked were so broad, and it was like, how am I supposed to answer this? It's like, right, that's the point. You get those fundamentals and then you branch out to your thing. Like, I'm going to write mine on title, as I mentioned earlier, but like several of the people in the class are going to do on various aspects of nuclear, like very different aspects though, because they really glommed onto that. Or someone else is going to go, no, solar. I love this. Like, and obviously all of our Scottish classmates are going, wind is the only way to go. So each one of those was unique, and this is something I did want to explore on the podcast. And again, just because Oxbridge is just such a tremendously unique experience for sort of what the disciplines look like. And I agree, it pushes a lot of that onus onto the students, which I really enjoyed that. I was like, well, your education, like if you want to know which direction to take, you can go to your professor immediately. They're like, oh, well, what are you interested in? Like, let's talk through it. But otherwise, it's like, no, this is self-directed. Like learn the things that you need to learn. In that sense, I agree with you that the undergraduate experience is even more so immersive. Can we talk through there a little bit? Like, they've got tutors and they've got various hours. Like, what again, I'm trying to sort of, expand on what the Cambridge and for that matter Oxford, even though if you decide to go that direction for some reason,
other brands are
but what that experience looks like from various. I played rugby, so I've got a particular, and we didn't do super well my years, so there's a particular beef I have with them, even though it's an obviously incredible school. But the Dark Blues are they're the rivals. But I'd love to give sort of that experience of what that looks like. For folks who have never gone through.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's, again, important to say that we have this, again, I don't know, luxury is the right word, but it, relatively labor intensive process that, again, from I'm not even sure what the financial implications of really trying to do this at a much broader level would be. It's clearly not, as I said, the reason why we do it primarily at the undergraduate is again, it's very labor intensive. So, you still have normal classes for undergraduates the way you would in any other university, but all of the kind of smaller kind of cohort teaching isn't done by a graduate student in a fairly large room, but done by normally a faculty member or a teaching officer, college teaching officer, in very small groups. And if you're doing this for 5-6 students, say 4, 5, 6 students, there's nowhere to hide, right? If you're in you have a large class of 200, and then you have 6 teaching kind of groups of 20 each. Well, in a group of 20, there's always back of the room, there's always silences and so on. Whereas if you're sitting essentially around a table, I think that changes the dynamic quite dramatically, and I think it it puts the onus on the student now to say something, right? To be able to say something. You can't get away with, there is nowhere to hide. There is nowhere to avoid the scrutiny, and you're dealing with somebody who really knows these issues well. And so I think that changes just the entire dynamic in a very important regard. I think there is something probably post-pandemic, especially, that I don't think the higher education or education more generally has kind of quite grappled with, and I think it was already coming, like many of these things, with MOOCs and other these kind of massive online courses. Getting the basic content is one thing, but then because of the internet, because of MOOCs, because of the approach to knowledge that we can kind of easily access it at our fingertips. Again, the world has moved on from the 1970s or 1980s or even 2000s. So the question then is, well, what are our educational institutions doing for students? And so I think it does. I think not just Cambridge but I think more generally, it kind of is a good reality check, a good maybe pause and think, okay, well, maybe we should do even more of this, frankly. What is, if we're able to spend some of our time just conveying information, do you need to be, it's kind of a, again, inefficient way of using somebody who's incredibly knowledgeable to just, click a switch, they're regurgitating exactly what they would have said to the previous class, right? So I think there is legitimate questions that again existed pre-COVID, but I think they're even more apparent after having gone through online education and so on. Well, how are we doing this? How are we actually expecting people to learn? And what is the value added that you get from having a live person in a room with live students? And I'd like to believe that at Cambridge we kind of have, at least in some ways, kind of making it more, by making it interactive, by making it really beneficial to be in that room is really important. But I think we can do a lot more, here to really think about, well, what is it that we are delivering live versus delivering in other forms. And I think obviously, as I said, different contexts, different systems aren't going to be able to just, oh, perfect. Here's this kind of small, a small group model that Cambridge has pioneered. We're just going to extrapolate it or deploy it over here. But I think more generally, we should be thinking as educators, as educational institutions, what is it that we can do?
That makes sense. To be honest with you, I as you were speaking, I just thought about one of the other things that I really enjoyed was the anonymous grading. That was actually, I mean, seriously, that way you could argue with your professor and not have that professor ding you on the grade. Not that they would do it on purpose, but it really removes that any type of bias. And I remember we had some phenomenal debates in various classes that I was in, et cetera, in between students with professors, et cetera, et cetera. And it didn't matter because it was like, this person is never going to know which paper is mine or what test is mine or any of these things. It's, again, from my perspective, it just seems like that Cambridge really put, Oxbridge really put some thought into how do we really facilitate this being student first? And again, as someone who comes from the software industry and, it's all about the user experience and UX is everything. I look at it the exact same way in education. I'm going, it should be all about the student experience, not at the detriment of the professors, of course, but that's the bread and butter. Let's try and do right by those folks, et cetera. And that was yet another thing that, even besides the small cohorts, et cetera, it was you also had anonymous grading so you could say what you needed to say type of deal.
Yeah. I do think that's, again, I think it helps us, right? I mean, in many ways it removes any potential bias. I don't have to worry about, there's no potential concern over who, am I be slightly, oh, that person's really keen, well, always really useful contributions in class. Am I going to be slightly nicer to that person? So it removes any of those considerations. And again, I think in general, it's trying to find the right mechanisms that line up, that allow us to, engage along these different dimensions. Again, still finding ways of, as I said, we have really relatively few contact hours, but can we find ways to continue to have that engagement? We've done for a number of years online blogs with our students that allows the students to go back and forth with each other in a kind of a more formal way. Yeah, so I think it's kind of trying to think about how we do this better, which is hard, right? Because the temptation is to, well, we've been doing it for this way for so long, why not continue to do it that way?
It's good adaptation. I mean, after 860 years or whatever it is, I mean, it's been.
Yeah, we're not totally clear. We celebrated our 800th anniversary in 2009. But
was that 800? I thought that was
no, it was 800. Yeah, only Oxford's older. But they burnt. There were some town and gown issues, so they burnt down the. So I think they roughly, they said 1209, but it's not totally clear.
Yeah, actually, having just, for those listening, David and I just met up literally just 2 weeks ago because I was in Cambridge, and I mean, the town and gown issues in Cambridge aren't very apparent at all. I mean, the townies seem to really like the folks. I loved the folks when I was there, et cetera. So it's good stuff. That said, I did want to run back into some of the technology policy stuff, which is, or not even necessarily technology, but some sort of policy stuff. But basically, there's some interesting disciplines. And again, I know this varies on a per country basis, but basically, you've advised some governmental bodies previously, served on various committees, et cetera. How do we make sure that this is continuing? And what I mean by that is, again, this constantly goes back to the Zuckerberg thing and these questions from some of these U.S. senators, and I'm sure the UK has their fill of people who just don't know what they're talking about as well. But basically, how do we make sure that people like yourself, among other folks, basically industry leaders, are on these boards and understand not only the science, the technology, et cetera, but also the nuances of dealing with these politicians and how these processes work and how it's like, well, we have to work in the confines, like, it's, I understand the tech. I understand how this works. I understand all the stuff. I can prove all these things, but like they're not speaking science. They don't speak in math terms. They don't speak in the scientific method. They speak in very much policy language, which is different in various countries. How do we make sure that folks like yourself continue to get on these places and make sure that we're making good, progressive, and not draconian, or for that matter, weak policy level decisions?
It's hard, right? Is one way of saying it. I mean, it's a in part because it's a diffusion process, and the way in which we kind of knowledge gets transferred is slow and imperfectly transmitted, and we kind of have to rely on existing pathways, some of which are sometimes in these institutions almost like sclerotic, like they're very difficult and not adaptive, and so again, one of the questions you would want to ask is, how can we get our kind of institutions to be more adaptive and more open to new information and to younger people and different disciplines and so on. And so some of that, again, it would be, can we find ways of trying to encourage that? I mean, I think sometimes you have within disciplines efforts to try and have that encourage that sort of engagement. How do you get more electrical engineers to to engage in the policy process, for example? At some level, also you have maybe within the private sector, within the individual companies, quite good, strong technical people, but then they might be a little bit insensitive or tone deaf to the concerns that the politicians or the policymakers will have, and although it's
I mean, basically, you're saying just because science says X doesn't necessarily mean that my electorate is on that side. So we may have to tweak these things. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, if you're coming at it from a scientific or technical perspective, you might have your view of the solution, and it's kind of a logically arranged solution. But the logic that a politician uses, or even a policymaker uses, won't necessarily be the same, because they have a different set of priorities, different set of pieces of knowledge and information that matter to them in a way that you as a approaching this in a purely technical way won't necessarily see eye to eye. And so again, sometimes you can have that problem, I think, with and frankly, big tech, I think, has not done a very good job of explaining its role. I mean, it kind of has evolved very quickly, but from a, I don't know if we think of it, say, from a government affairs point of view, not just pure lobbying, throwing money at things, but really kind of trying to shape discussions. I don't think they've done a particularly good job of that, because there's often this sense of, we know better than you, or trust us, it's technical, or let us do our thing, don't interfere with us, and so on. So again, I think it's hard, because you get it's almost like dialogue of the deaf sometimes between, the folks who are politicians or lawyers or who see things in a much more, oh, that's what that side says. What does the other side say? Versus, the technical people who'd be like, no, it's not, there's no sides. It's the kind of movement of the scientific frontier and knowledge, and we're getting, more knowledgeable about these things. And so it's almost this culture clash, and the language that we have doesn't really, or the relatively few people that can go back and forth between these different groups. So the more people that we can get who can speak to both sides, if you want, I think that's what that's what I would want to see more of.
That sounds about right. What should we be looking for in the future? What is the future of energy policy, or for that matter, this technology policy? What's coming?
Well, I mean, I think what we're seeing is a remarkable acceleration of regulation, of legislation, of attention to these issues, of startups wanting to launch new ideas, new products. I think that's being facilitated by government investment, government policy that's also kind of pushing in that direction. But by the same token, there is also the reality of kind of the slow nature of deployment, and also places like not just the U.S. but more generally, potential for backlash and pushback against efforts to try and move too quickly or get people to change their lives too quickly. I think there are big issues from a distributional point of view. Electric vehicles, I don't know, the average electric vehicle needs half as many people to produce it as a fossil vehicle. They're more expensive. So for people who are in the top half of the income distribution, buying an electric vehicle is a pretty easy thing to get their head around. If you're in the bottom half of this distribution, it's looking, more challenging. We're in a world where just in the last year, since the Russian invasion, energy prices have gone way up. That's put a lot of households who were, on the, near on or near the poverty line. All of a sudden you're asking them to find another X hundred or X thousand even dollars or pounds or euros to put onto these bills. And the idea that, dealing with climate might mean even higher bills is should set off alarm bells. So I think there are these big tensions. So at the one hand, you've got excitement and energy kind of excitement behind new technologies, new kind of policy drivers moving things along quite quickly. And then on the other hand, it's question of how quickly you can bring people along. Can we do this in a way that won't end up with kind of such a backlash that we get into grinding to a halt again?
Makes sense. Okay. This has been definitely interesting, but now here comes the big question. The big question. As we wrap things up here, my question to you is, as always, if there was some sort of technology related to your field that you could sort of magic wand into existence, what would that technology be? What would it look like?
So it has to be a technology, does it?
You can run whatever direction you want with this question. I'm just kind of curious. What would it be?
I mean, to me, I think it is a question of, and this is, maybe it's some of the things we've talked about, but it is getting better people in place to make our policies to design these things better, right? So I don't think we have a technology problem on energy and climate. I think we have a capacity problem. Are we designing regulations that really incentivize energy storage in the right way, that kind of get us pushing in the right direction? So maybe it is a magic wand to replace a good chunk of our legislatures with more, younger, more technically educated people who will be both more conscious of kind of these longer term issues, but also will have the kind of capacity to kind of come up with the kind of nuanced policies that we need to deal with, whether that's AI or climate change. I think it's very similar. What are the sorts of mindset, what are the sorts of backgrounds that you need people to have to really grapple with these really quite difficult trade-offs going forward?
Makes total sense to me. David, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for being on. It was illuminating, highly illuminating. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Genuine pleasure, David.
Absolutely. And with that, we have been standing on the shoulders of giants. Thank you.